I'm going to be talking about a model for participatory research in psychiatry. My intention was to actually kind of present the full model that I am currently developing in my book, but that didn't happen due to constraints of time. So I'm going to kind of talk around it a little bit. So as we have seen in the presentations before us, knowledge generation, especially in psychiatry, is multiplex. But my focus will be kind of thinking about psychiatry as primarily an intervention-oriented science, where the goals of scientific inquiry are helping individuals with mental disorders or service users or patients, however we might refer to them, improve the quality of their lives, whether that's through full kind of intervention, treatment, and recovery, or learning to live with kind of challenges involved around mental disorders. And when we look at the psychiatric landscape, we see something like what philosopher Miriam Solomon calls epistemic rituals, in that there is no one way of doing psychiatric research in psychiatry. There are multiple practices. So there are scientific practices that include from medication trials to neuroscientific studies to trying to come up with classifications of mental disorders. Also, there's a lot of kind of knowledge generated coming from clinical practices through publication of case studies or kind of in general clinicians' involvement with patients, knowledge coming out of that. There's also a lot of knowledge on mental health or in psychiatry that is generated through self-reports, what I'm going to refer to in general as self-reports. Some of them are in the form of individuals with lived experiences writing, about their experiences, whether it's through, publications of books or blogs or in any other format. And there's also kind of networks like Hearing Voices Network or Neurodiversity Movement or, Mad Pride Movement, where kind of collectively individuals publish on and, generate knowledge about their experiences. So all of these are extremely resourceful and important to advance our understanding of interventions in psychiatry. However, traditionally, self-reports have been neglected or undermined by kind of psychiatric researchers. And one example that I'm going to show is going to be focusing on is opioid use disorders and in the context of overdose epidemic and the engagement of the DSM creators with the overdose epidemic. And then I'm going to kind of, say basically that, there has been a lot of resistance from, some psychiatric circles, including patients or service users in kind of psychiatric research, primarily about concerns on objectivity. However, the notion of objectivity employed there is very limited, and I will propose an alternative way of thinking about objectivity in psychiatry, which I call participatory interactive objectivity, according to which patient and user inclusion is actually necessary for objectivity. And I will deal with some objections. So I take patients' self-reports as approximations of subjective experience with mental disorders. And traditionally, this has been neglected. And when I say this, sometimes people say to me, well, look, no, I mean, that's all, the psychiatry is all about self-reports. The patient goes to the doctor and they talk to someone and, they are uttering their experiences, what it is like. And then the clinician, offers a solution to them, or even in the development of guides like the DSM, it's all about like self-reports. However, that's not the kind of self-report that I'm referring to here. As the previous presenters kind of pointed out, patients as subjects who do research or who develop knowledge about mental disorders have not been kind of given as much uptake. And this has been costly, both epistemically and ethically, due to lack of inclusion of self-reports or patients or service users' first-person perspectives. We have not understood the full fabric of mental disorder experience on the one hand, and that meant that we have not been able to provide all the kind of resources that these individuals needed. And DSM, of course, is one example for this. So here's kind of what I have been writing about over the course of last 12 years about what exactly is it that we learn from the self-reports of service users who are experiencing kind of mental disorder and mental health challenges? And from my reading of these first-person accounts, we learn what I call orientational challenges. So this is basically the raw experience or the raw encounter with mental health challenges, where you have difficulty getting out of bed in the morning, or you have difficulty sleeping. So this is kind of the raw experience. There's also a lot that we learn from these first-person accounts about how that kind of first-person encounter with illness intersects with other more intersectional dimensions of persons. So I call these hyper-narratives, where in people's interpersonal relationships, social and cultural dynamics, race, gender, all those kind of identity-building constituents of individuals interact or kind of are enmeshed with illness experience. We also learn a lot about the therapeutic impact of psychiatric diagnoses, what helps, what doesn't help, what helps for whom, and so on and so forth. And we also learn a lot about what I've called reflective impact of diagnosis, where the ways in which we think about mental disorders might shape the way we conceive ourselves. Of course, this is familiar from Hacking's work when he talked about the looping effects of psychiatric diagnoses. We also learn from these first-person accounts a lot about coping and how individuals have kind of coped with the stigma, coped with the challenges themselves, and the kind of path for flourishing. And here, when I think about flourishing, I'm not thinking necessarily about the kind of absence of any kind of mental disorder or mental health challenge, but rather kind of learning to live with that experience, but still growing as an individual. So one place that I'm going to look at where kind of self-reports or first-person perspectives have been neglected is the opioid use disorder and the overdose epidemic. So right now, both in the United States and Canada, there's a crisis involving overdose, opioid overdose. And this is basically kind of a fact sheet released by the White House. So basically, the stats are really bad. More than 100,000 Americans died due to drug overdose in the last 12-month period. So the numbers are really grim. So when we look at the kind of landscape for treating or intervening on overdoses or opioid use disorders, it's kind of quite fractured. So opioids are very addictive chemicals that interact with our opioid receptors and reduce pain. There's a very short period before someone develops a full-on dependence. And abrupt stopping leads to several withdrawal symptoms, and then that's usually after periods of those abrupt stopping that people might die from overdoses. So in the United States, abstinence-based programs are very dominant, but they have very poor outcomes, largely due to withdrawal symptoms. So there's more success in maintenance therapy, where patients receive injectable opioids under supervised conditions. And that comes in varieties. So this diagram here on the left is basically a continuum of care model. And this is a kind of a model that's widely used around the world, where patients' withdrawal is managed by kind of methadone treatments, like they're called agonist therapies. And then it's kind of usually a sliding scale. So the person kind of starts off with maybe like methadone maintenance, and then kind of goes to not using or abstaining for a while and coming back. So there's also a form of maintenance therapy that involves supervised injection of heroin. It used to be called heroin-assisted treatment, but due to kind of stigma associated with heroin, it's now there are different kind of terms for it, different agonist treatments. And this kind of opioid agonist treatment is very effective, and it's usually used amongst patients who are not responding well to the methadone intervention. And kind of you try that, and then if that doesn't work, you kind of do heroin-assisted treatment, and there's really kind of good outcomes. So, and this form of treatment is legal and supervised and supported by mostly European countries like Denmark, Netherlands, and United Kingdom. However, heroin-assisted treatment is illegal in Canada and the United States. So, and the illegality is grounded not on scientific reasons, but primarily for political reasons. So, for instance, in the DSM-5, maintenance, there's a kind of section on maintenance therapy. They define maintenance therapy as primarily therapy by methadone treatment. So the kind of possibility of using perhaps heroin as a form of maintenance therapy is not even considered. It's not even discussed as an option. And this is true for in the various kind of treatment documents that are developed by the United States government in general. So Daniel Steele and I have wrote this paper on what are the kind of what might be the scientific reasons for rejecting heroin-assisted treatment as a form of treatment, and we kind of argue that there is none. So we should change that. So I encourage you, if you're interested in this topic, to go check out that paper. But what I'm going to kind of look at here is a study that was conducted in Canada, in Vancouver. It's called a study to assess long-term opioid medication effectiveness. So this was this was one of the studies in Vancouver that provided heroin-assisted treatment to users and kind of to assess outcomes. So there was a lot of lobbying of the British Columbia government of kind of starting to allow heroin-assisted treatment as a form of treatment. And in this study, we heard a lot from people who were participants in the study, in that their self-reports have been published. So what these individuals note is that this study gave my dignity back. They cite being able to hold kind of employment, being able to get off the streets under this kind of like supervised conditions of treatment, and how they appreciated having a clinical, kind of assistance in, receiving this medication in the meantime while they're getting health care that otherwise they do not have access. So in short, they have reported a lot on the kind of effectiveness of heroin-assisted treatment. So in this case, this was kind of an ideal kind of case where individuals with experience, first-person experience, came together kind of in this study. But then later on, not only there were scientific and clinical publications that emerged out of the study, but they also heard a lot from individuals' experiences. So they published articles about telling their stories with heroin-assisted treatment and SNAP activism in downtown Vancouver. And after the study ended, they formed this group, a peer-run research participant group that they call SNAP, a Salome Naomi Association of Patients. And they basically kind of developed, research principles to guide critical methodological frameworks on community-based research for social justice. And they published on kind of comparing the life of these individuals prior to this study, as well as what they have learned from the clinical settings and routines, how that kind of stability allowed them to kind of grow and flourish in other periods of their lives. But here's the catch: this study ended, right? And heroin-assisted treatment is still illegal in Vancouver, and like it's not even being talked about as an option really in the United States, unfortunately. And then there's kind of like these patients are now like left out, right? So they have collaborated together to offer a constitutional challenge to the Supreme Court of BC to continue receiving heroin-assisted treatment after the trial ended, and they advocated for the necessity of kind of establishment of these kinds of programs, like more harm reduction models in opioid use treatment. What's really this is a great example of the good things that come by including research or service users in psychiatric research, but also the kind of things that we should be wary of when we are doing this research, because once the study ends, these people are kind of like left out to dry. And then, there must be kind of good measures taken to protect these individuals when they participate in research involving these kinds of drugs. So, but I use this example to kind of show and illustrate how this kind of first-person raw data, kind of knowledge coming from service users is very important. I mean, it can really be kind of helpful as like thinking, oh yeah, actually maybe we should reconsider the kind of legal ban on heroin-assisted treatment, because it looks like people who are otherwise not responding to other methadone treatments and so on are responding really well to heroin-assisted treatment. So maybe we should reconsider our policies or scientific research around this issue. So then neglect of self-reports has harmful epistemic and ethical consequences. So there has been a lot of activism to change this, at least in the context of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, in the creation of the manual. Prior to the publication of the DSM-5, there has been extensive calls to the American Psychiatric Association to include patients and perhaps even their families to be part of the DSM working group that revises the DSM manual. So, and this kind of call came both from philosophers and psychiatrists like John Sadler and Bill Fulford, but also from a lot of patient advocacy groups, as well as clinicians and psychiatrists who work directly with patients. The DSM-5 task force was reluctant to allow this to happen, and it did not happen in the end. And they kind of appeared like they're open to including patients kind of from a political standpoint, whereas but they were not really open to it from like an epistemic standpoint. And what do I mean by this? They basically said, okay, let's then open kind of public feedback on the DSM-5 so that people can enter this draft document and what they think about their draft document. But this was not specific to service users or patient groups. This was rather open to kind of general public. And what really worries me about this is that there's no recognition that individuals with kind of direct experience have something, actually, really, really important to offer that a random member of the public cannot offer. So they were not open, therefore, epistemically for the inclusion of patients. And I just published an article that's forthcoming in Philosophy of Science about this. The reason for not including patients in the DSM-5 task force was that, well, what patients will say is subjective, but here we are trying to do objective science and trying to develop an objective criteria. And how do we include, like when we include patients, which of their perspectives we consider and so on. So this is a very, very short paper, and the authors, the members of the task force do not really develop in detail what exactly they mean by objectivity or subjectivity in science. And as philosophers of science, we know that both of these notions are extremely loaded, and there are different senses of objectivity and subjectivity that are not necessarily reducible to one another. One way to kind of move forward here is, like, I'm not going to go into detail much, is that like there seems to be an assumption in this kind of scientific community, in the DSM community, DSM creator community, I should say, about what exactly science looks like. And this kind of idea of like what science is and how it's objective kind of carries a lot of kind of reminiscence of like older ways of thinking about science that we inherited from kind of logical positivism. Rather, I want to invite psychiatric or scientific researchers in psychiatry to think about kind of psychiatry as a primarily an intervention-oriented science, and take into account the goals of inquiry, which I take to be intervention, in thinking about the scientific status of psychiatry. And if we do that, we might actually develop a different picture of science in psychiatry that involves actually active involvement of service users. So I call this alternative model participatory interactive objectivity, and this model heavily draws on feminist epistemology and feminist philosophy of science. And my kind of model here is that patients or service users must participate in psychiatry for epistemic reasons. Their inclusion and interaction with other experts is not only not harmful, but in fact necessary to establish an objective kind of psychiatry. And this process, this model necessarily recognizes that objectivity is rather a process, a value-laden process that's intrinsically interactive, the outcome of which is psychiatric knowledge. So here, in the kind of participatory interactive objectivity model, I take very seriously kind of feminist epistemologists who talked about the epistemic implications of our social locations. And in Lorraine Coe's case, for instance, the social location meant knower's gender. Similarly, Harding wrote about how the failure to account for women's experiences results with androcentric assumptions in science, and that's harmful. So similarly, I think we can make this kind of move that says not including service user experiences will result with more ableist assumptions in psychiatric science that will be harmful for knowledge generation. And here I also take very seriously the approach of like some STS science and technology studies scholars work on expertise. What does it mean to be an expert? When we think about expertise, we should not be just thinking about kind of those with training or scientific and clinical training on mental disorders, but rather the service users' experience. And again, Anna and her co-presenters kind of talked about patients as service users as experts, and that was really refreshing to hear. So in that sense, we can kind of think about science being then a group of experts that involve both psychiatrists and service users. And similarly, some philosophers of medicine have talked about epistemic implications of patients' conditions, and that how patients or service users' perspectives might provide evidence that might be overlooked in more conventional settings. And more recently, I'm very happy to be sharing the kind of same conference panel here with both Bennett and Anne-Marie and Sarah's works on kind of how, what we might kind of gain from thinking about service users as being participants of knowledge generation community, and the ways in which we might kind of overcome hermeneutical and epistemic injustices in the context of psychiatry. So, and in this process, so this is kind of like how this picture works. So, nobody, like no particular expert, whether it's the expert scientist or expert patient, gets to kind of have a final say. So in this model, interaction amongst different experts is necessary. So in that sense, I kind of imagine psychiatric science as for a form of social science knowledge where objectivity is a feature of the scientific process, and it's not just the opposite of subjectivity, as the DSM creators seem to be assuming. And far from automatically compromising knowledge produced, as Alison Wiley wrote, objectivity may be substantially improved by the kind of varying values that are brought to the table by different kinds of experts. So this is how this picture looks. In an ideal world, this is the kind of interaction and the community of researchers that we have that generate knowledge in psychiatry. So, and I think, going back to earlier point about like pluralisms, we must really embrace this kind of pluralistic approach in psychiatry or in knowledge generation in psychiatry. And what I would imagine for each of these knowledge producing contexts, whether it's the DSM work groups or the kind of SNAP research group in Vancouver, or activists in the United States who are promoting harm reduction models for use disorders and so on, each of these kind of loci of knowledge must involve this first-person reports, first-person experiencers, scientists, and clinicians. But for this kind of dynamic interaction and knowledge production to occur, we must have some kind of guidelines for doing this kind of work, because there will be egos, there will be disagreements, there will be lack of recognition of the other group's kind of knowledge, and so on and so forth. So for this, again, we can kind of start with where Longina started in developing her view of objectivity in science, where she wrote about the kind of necessity of transformative criticism in this objective process of scientific knowledge generation. So what would this mean for psychiatry? There has to be avenues for criticism where patient experts, service user experts come together with other experts. So I think Sam's conference is a great example and great model for this kind of work. We need more of more conversations like this, where different experts kind of share their different standpoints and their knowledge. There has to be recognized that intellectual authority is shared, that an MD does not know more than a patient expert. There has to be trust between the community of experts, trust in so many ways. And one way of kind of thinking about trust might be really believing when the person testifies, their perspective or kind of their knowledge. There has to be respect, and there has to be also an openness to criticism. So, and this kind of applies to kind of all groups, right? Like, there has to be kind of embracing of this like critical engagement. And the more I read Harding, the more I think about kind of her emphasis on reflexivity in general as a feature of this process, where I think all technical experts and experts by experience have to be really, really reflexive about their own prejudices and their own judgments and their kind of understanding of their own experiences and their own knowledge. In this picture, there's no automatic epistemic privilege. Everybody starts in a kind of, starts with an equal space, equal place, and rather it's the conversation and the debate and the kind of general transformative criticism process that produces knowledge. And also it's very important that we not be tokenists. So I can easily imagine in this kind of political climate in the United States, for the DSM-5 task force, for instance, or DSM 5.2 task force, having one patient representative and say, hey, look, you wanted patient representatives in the group, now we have one. And I think that might be too tokenistic to kind of build that kind of structure. So I can see kind of this move. I mean, it was very heartening to see how things are shifting in Canada. That's been my observation as well. There's a lot more emphasis even in call for grant applications by CIHR or even SHRC to include, community-based research or participant involvement in scientific research. I am not seeing that quite in the American Psychiatric Association or the National Institute of Mental Health Networks, but there are some other kind of, venues where there's that kind of makes me optimistic a little bit. So patient-centered outcomes research institute in the United States, for instance, cares a lot about involvement of patients or, service users in the context of medical research. And recently they have started talking about this kind of stakeholder alliances in care for dementia, Alzheimer's, and those kinds of similar illnesses. So I'm interested to see how this will expand to the context of psychiatry and mental health. Department of Defense in the United States, again, is a very interestingly kind of progressive funding agency in so many ways, in that they really want anything that would work. So they have been in their grant proposals inviting patient user involvement in research on PTSD. And I have been collaborating with some colleagues here at UTSA who work on substance use disorders amongst veterans, and some of them are funded by the Department of Defense. And it's exciting to see that there is a kind of place for where we might be able to include more service users actively in scientific research. It's another place to kind of look at is coming from the UK that some of you might be familiar. So there's a group of patients who have been experiencing smell loss and related challenges for years and years. And due to COVID's impact on our sense of smell, this area of research has been kind of revitalized. In fact, a long-time service user, a patient herself, Chris Kelly, who founded this organization called Absent, has started getting a lot of attention from COVID researchers. Once it was found out that smell loss it can be a symptom and a very debilitating symptom of COVID, and now she and her colleagues are developing guidelines for doing research that involves patients. And actually, Chris Kelly and I are working on a paper now that she really wants to title "How to Not Do Research Involving Patients." take all the data and leave. So that's been some of her experience in collaborating with scientists. So she's very kind of invested in developing general guidelines that involve patients as researchers. So I think we have, in the context of psychiatry, we have a lot to learn from the work that she and her colleagues have done. So then finally, to come to the end of this, I take participatory interactive objectivity model to be really fitting with the goals of inquiry in psychiatry if we kind of think about the relevance of intervention or the premise of intervention in understanding in mental disorders, and how that could be advanced by making sure that service users are participants, direct generators of knowledge in the context of psychiatry. So there is going to be some resistance. So somebody might say, look, what the patient with COVID and who's experiencing smell loss, what they kind of can bring to the table is not really necessarily the same with what a person with mental illness can bring to the table, because mentally ill patients are irrational. I mean, that's kind of this kind of gut reaction-y objection. But there's actually no conclusive data, as I don't have to even say that in this group, that people with mental disorder diagnoses lack rationality. In fact, there is research that shows the opposite, that patients are fully capable of rational decision making. We might think about limited epistemic agency in the context of mental illness experience, but mental illnesses do not necessarily or universally interrupt epistemic agency. Not all conditions create those kinds of impairments, and even if they do, they have varying degrees of severity and transiency and so on. So I think this kind of objection is reflective more of a stigma around mental disorders rather than reality. And plus, we can kind of think of limited epistemic agency in other research contexts as well. If you are severely, sexist or racist, that will definitely kind of limit your epistemic agency as a knower, because you will be too prejudiced to think objectively about certain phenomena. Plus, in this kind of model, there has to be a selection criteria, and there are kind of processes like transformative criticism and the importance of that participatory interactivity that might kind of overcome with some of the potential challenges that might come out of these types of issues and concerns. Another one is kind of more perhaps significant, especially coming from kind of in a lot of philosophy circles and psychology circles, about the unreliability of self-reports. So people like curators have written extensively on how subjective reports are systematically inaccurate and they're unreliable scientific tools. Someone like him might say, well, we might even have more reasons to doubt the scientific reliability of self-reports coming from individuals with diagnosis of mental disorders. Similarly, Nisbet and Wilson's famous work in 1970s about the, how self-reports about the cause of our actions are often mistaken and unreliable. Similar skepticism comes even by some philosophers of psychiatry when they say, this is primarily applies to the context of autobiographical writing, but Somoj Varga and Jennifer Radin have written on how it's hard to it's hard for autobiographical writing to be reflective of the true nature of depressive experience because individuals might kind of have a lot of lack of transparency in understanding their own self-experiences. So I think these skepticisms are perhaps warranted and important to keep in mind. But again, we should not really make a kind of broad generalization about what these kinds of inaccuracies might imply for inclusion of service users in psychiatric research. For instance, there is no significant body of empirical evidence that supports a general dismissal of self-reports in the context of psychiatry. And in fact, in science in general, there are lots of areas of science, like science of perception, that relies heavily on subjective reports. And we know a lot of philosophers like Barry Smith or Majvita Chirimuta, who has written on the kind of what we learned from the subjective reports of individuals when we're doing perceptive research. So, and again, in general, the general criteria, selection criteria, transformative criticism, and that interactive, critical, reflexive process are ways to kind of block some of these kinds of problems emerging in the context of psychiatric research. And my other kind of general response to these kinds of objections is like, look, we have not included service users actively in psychiatric research for so long, and we're nowhere close to addressing any of the challenges. So why don't we now include service users and see what happens? And I think we kind of have to have this open mind and deal with the potential problems as they come along, rather than kind of preemptively not including service users for kind of these arguments about, due to these arguments about a rather kind of older view of what science should look like. In fact, when we look into the past, we have benefited, or the DSM benefited heavily by including people who have lived experience in kind of contemplations. And here I have in mind the removal of homosexuality from the DSM in 1973. And a lot of activists who were psychiatrists at the same time, they were gay activists who in the psychiatric community, they lobbied heavily on the removal of homosexuality from the DSM. The most important of whom I take to be Henry Anonymous, Dr. John Fryer, who famously gave a talk at the 1972 meeting of the American Psychiatric Association. And I think Henry Anonymous's example shows something else that's important that I listed as the values that we should think about in involving service users to psychiatric research, is this trust and shared intellectual authority. I don't know if Dr. Fryer's talk would have had the same effect had he not been a psychiatrist himself. Not that he has to be a psychiatrist, but I think the psychiatric community, the psychiatrists were willing to trust him because there was another MD reporting on their experiences. So I think this really emphasizes the importance of this understanding of shared intellectual authority and trust amongst the group who are participating in research. Also, if you haven't seen it, just last month in May, there was a great write-up about Dr. Fryer in the New York Times about how he disappeared basically after he gave that speech, which I really enjoyed. So in the end, then, the conclusion is self-reports coming from directly service users are good approximations of subjective dimensions of mental disorders, and that their inclusion should be the ways in which we conduct science in psychiatry. And I think philosophy and philosophy of psychiatry has a very, very important role to play, as we can even see in this conference, in bringing these different perspectives to the same table and allowing this kind of critical reflection to occur in advancing psychiatric knowledge. And thank you so much for your participation.